My name is Jo Franchetti. I'm a member of the Samsung Internet Dev Advocacy team. This is when I usually have my spiel about what Samsung Internet is, but you've all heard Dan and Laszlo and everybody else talk about it already this morning. If you want to find me on Twitter, This is Jo Frank, and I also write a lot of front-end dev stuff on Medium, so you can find me at Jo Franchetti on there. So what we're here to actually talk about today is CSS Grid. Now, Grid is the future of web layout, but before we talk about the future, I think it's a good idea to look at things that we did in the past so that we can see why Grid is so brilliant for us. So let's take a look at an example. Your designer, who it turns out is really into cats, has asked you to build this. And so let's say, for argument's sake, what we've got here is a grid of cards. Each of those cards are 300 pixels wide at their widest. So because we are good developers, we care about the web, we're building responsive. We don't want these to get any wider than 300 pixels. They're 200 pixels high, and there's a 20 pixel gap in between each one. So let's take a look at how we might have built this in the past, and then we'll talk about how we would build it with Grid. So before any of you start shuddering, in the past, we might have built this with a table. And I know it's horrible, but I think it's good if we have a look at the code and we look at why we don't do this anymore. So this might be an example. Can you all see that? This might be an example of how we might have built this with the table. The things to note here that are not great are the fact that our layout is in our HTML. So we've had to build up rows and cells in our HTML, and really we want those things to be in our CSS. There is one nice thing that came from tables, which is this line here, this border spacing. So we could essentially define the gap that we wanted in between each of our table cells. It wasn't additive in the way that margin is, so we could just define it as 20 pixels because we wanted a 20 pixel space, and it would be 20 pixels. The problem with it is that it puts gap around the outside as well. And there's a whole load of problems with tables that we don't really want. We want our styling to be in our CSS. We want our content to be in our HTML. So let's move away from tables and have a look at inline block, which is another option that we could have used to build this. With inline block, it means that we can write some much nicer markup. So each cell is now an article with an image and a heading, much more semantic, much nicer. Let's have a look at the CSS that we might have used. So our layout for our articles and our cards is now in our CSS, and we have set the article display there to inline block, which means that the articles are going to sit next to each other. The problem with inline is that it's really made for words, for text. So a word has a space to the right and just below it of a few pixels. So that's going to also apply to our cards. And that means that when we try and set the width, I don't know if you can see it up there, the contrast isn't very high, but my width should be 980 pixels. It's ended up being 989 pixels because each card has got a little 3 pixel space to the right of it, which is horrible. And if you don't know that that's happening and you use inline block, you can spend ages trying to debug why your card is dropped down to the next line when you set your width to a sensible width. So inline block, we kind of don't really want that. So instead, we could use float. Our markup doesn't change here. We still got our nice semantic markup. We now put float on the article instead of using inline block. They're already display blocks, so we don't need to change that. The problem that we now have is that our container is going to collapse. So if we wanted to put any styling on the container, we then would have to use this clearfix class, which is horrible. It's extra CSS that's only there to fix a thing that we used because we were trying to do some layout, and now we have to put extra CSS in there, which is really not what we want. So what came to save us from all of this? Flexbox. And for many web developers, Flexbox was the answer to so many prayers. the problems of which I just told you about. So let's take a look at what Flexbox gave us. Our markup hasn't changed. But what we can do is we display flex. We've got this option of flex wrap, which lets our boxes wrap onto the next line. And it's just a much smaller and much nicer amount of CSS. We currently in Flex have no way to set the gap between each of the cells, though that is coming to Flex in the near future. The major problem with Flex is that what we're building here is a two-dimensional layout. We have rows and columns, and Flex was made for single-dimensional layouts. It was made for either a single row or a single column when you want something in a line. And yes, we have the wrap option, but especially when you start using columns instead of rows, that wrap option gets a little bit difficult to use if you're trying to space things out in a particular way. It's just not quite the exact tool that we wanted. What we wanted was a tool that gives us the bits that we like out of each of these, so that gap, the ability to sit things next to each other. We want the ease of Flex, this small amount of code. We want something with really nice syntax that makes readable sense. And what we got was CSS Grid. So let's talk a little bit about the language of CSS Grid, and then I'm going to talk about how we actually use it to build things. So the CSS Grid properties apply either to the parent, so that's the thing that's containing the things that you want to align, or to the children, which are the grid elements or the grid cells. The grid lines are the horizontal and vertical lines that go between each cell, and the grid tracks are either the rows or the columns. And the grid gap is the space between. I can illustrate this a bit better if we go back to our original design. So this would be our grid container. This is a grid cell, or sometimes you'll see it written as a grid element. This is a grid track, which is either a row or a column. The grid lines are the lines that split each cell. And then we've got the grid gap, which is the space in between each one. So now that we have this new language, we can talk about how we would actually build that original design. So our CSS is going to look something like this. We've got display grid to set. It is grid. That's fairly sensible. That makes sense. We've got a grid gap of 20 pixels because we want a gap between each element of 20 pixels. And then we've got that line in the middle, and there's quite a lot of stuff happening there. So let's break it down. We've got the grid template columns, which means we're going to define the track sizing for each of the columns. And then we've got the repeat function, which is taking two arguments, which is taking autofill and min-max. The first argument is going to define the number of column tracks, and the second is going to define the width that those column tracks should be. So we've set the number of column tracks to autofill, which means that the number of tracks is going to increase as the width increases and we can fit those column tracks in. And we've set the width that we want those tracks to be min-max 250 pixels, 1 fraction unit. Now min-max says I want it to be a minimum of 250 pixels wide and a maximum of 1 FR. Now an FR is a fraction unit. So what we're saying here is equally divide up the space into fractions and give 1 fraction's worth of width to that. So what's going to happen if we start at maybe a mobile size and we think about our design, we're going to have maybe a 320 wide screen, which is going to fit 1 column of 250 pixel images in it. As the screen gets wider, that image is going to get wider till the point where another 250 image could fit next to it. And then we'll end up with 2 columns. As we get wider, once we get to the point where another 250 track can fit in there, we're going to have 3 columns. Let's see. Oh, wow. Let's zoom in a little bit. There we go. Let's see this in action. If I drop the size down. So this would be our mobile size with our grid enlarging till the point where we can fit 2 tracks of 250 pixel wide next to each other, and so on and so forth. So let's talk about something a little bit more complicated. Our designer has now decided that we want to build something that's a little bit more showy than just equal size cards. They've come up with this new design, and we're going to build this next. So we're going to take our developer eye, and we're going to decide how we might divide that up into a sensible grid. And because I designed this, and because I've decided it, I'm going to say that it is a grid of 6 columns. So I'm going to set up my grid like this, with each column being 1 fraction unit wide. So I've said display grid, grid template columns, 6 times 1 FR. Or you could set it up like this, it's exactly the same. And then what we can do is we can use this span option. So grid gives us some really great options for our grid column and our grid row layouts. We can have a really sort of fine-tuned control over where our cells are going to sit, how they're going to stretch. And we can use the span property, which is going to stretch it from its starting point across the number of columns or rows that you tell it to span. So for example, grid column span 2, it's going to start at whatever grid line that it starts at, and then span 2 columns. Grid row 2/4 means I want this one to start on grid line number 2 and end on grid line number 4. And these numbers for the grid lines can be positive or negative if you so wish. So these would be our numbered grid lines. If we wanted to go negative, it would start at the right-hand side with -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. It's an option that's available to you. You can use it when you're setting which one you want it to start and end at. Grid also offers us the grid area property, which lets us define a 2-dimensional area that we want the cell to sit in. So that's made up of your grid row start, then your grid column start, then your grid row end, and then your grid column end. And you can define a space that you want that cell to sit on. And so now that we've got this kind of language defined and we understand a bit more about how to actually use CSS, we can use it to build the holy grail of web layout. What does the holy grail of web layout look like? It looks like this. So you've probably seen this layout all over the web. There is a header and a footer. There's this sort of main section in the middle with 2 sidebars. And the thing that's important about this is that it stretches. Our footer is always sat at the bottom of the page. No matter how little content we have in the main, the footer is always going to be at the bottom of our viewport. And it's responsive, so we could change the width. So let's talk about how we might build this. Again, with our developer eye, when you see a layout like that, you should start thinking, how am I going to split this up into a grid? And when I look at it, I see a 3x3 grid. And from the rules that our designer's given us, we know the width of the 2 sidebars, which for argument's sake, let's say are 200 pixels wide each. They don't change. Only the center changes with the responsive layout. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set them to 200 pixels, and we're going to let the middle column stretch and squish with the page. We also know that we want the header to be at the top of the page. We want the footer to sit at the bottom of the page. So that means that the container is going to be 100 VH. Are we all comfortable with VH as a unit? Thumbs, yeah? So if we write our CSS, it's going to look like this. So we've got display grid there. We've got our grid template columns. So I've set it to 200 pixels on either side and then one fraction unit in the middle. So it's going to take whatever space is left and assign it to that middle one. We've got our grid template rows, which we're setting to auto on the top and the bottom because we don't know how much content people are going to put in the header and the footer. We want them to be allowed to stretch as they fill with content. But again, one FR in the middle so that the remaining space is assigned to that middle row. And then we put min height of 1 VH on there. And then the final thing that we need to do, because we want our header and our footer to span all three columns, is that we give each of them a style of grid column span 3, which means that they're going to span all three columns. And that's it. That is the entire of that layout, which used to be a nightmare to build in CSS, written in 5 lines of CSS. So I hope that you're sort of starting to see the joy of CSS Grid, but it does come with some safety warnings. So with great power comes great responsibility. And as you saw with the grid column and grid row positioning, we can make an element start and end wherever we want it to be, regardless of the order that it is in our HTML. And Grid also gives us some really brilliant tools for making like masonry layouts, and it can look super awesome. But let's have a look at an example and we'll see why this might be a problem. So I've got here, can you all see that? I've got here a large number of items which are all in order, as you can see in the markup. And then I've got them in display grid, and I've set this grid autoflow to dense, which means that as it fills up, it's going to put the items in order. But if an item can fit in a hole that was left behind by a bigger item, then it's going to shove it back to the beginning. And this starts to be a problem because we have things like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then, okay, 11, 12, 3, 14, 5, 13, 15, 16. And if we start taking this smaller, this is when it really starts to become a problem. 1, 2, 3, 4, can't even read what that is, 5, 6, 7. The items start to not be in the order that we might expect them to be in. And this is fine for us users that have good sight, that have good motor control skills. You know, we can use a mouse, we can click around, but your users who are tabbing through this content or who are perhaps having this content read to them aren't going to be able to interact with your site in the way that you're maybe expecting them to. So use Grid responsibly, I think, is the message that I'm trying to give there. Grid also isn't a killer of everything that came before it. Grid is really useful for laying things out in a grid, but it's the tools that we had before, like Flexbox, are still entirely relevant for the things they were built for. So if you want a single row or a single column of content, Flexbox is still a better tool for that, and it's still my favorite tool for centering things horizontally and vertically. The next thing that we should talk about, obviously, is browser support. It's actually better than, well, it's pretty damn good at the moment. And for the browsers that don't use it, we can use @supports to write our fallback. So if I was going to use @supports, I would use it like this. I would write my flex styling. I would write my float or whatever for the people who don't support Flex. And then I would use my @supports to overwrite all of that for the browsers that support Grid. So I use this @supports display grid, and then I would put all my grid styles in there. let's have a look at the actual current support. It's not bad. We don't talk about previous versions of IE. So that's CSS Grid in a nutshell. I now have some other exciting CSS Grid bits that I really love that I would like to share with you. So firstly, your pseudo elements, so your before and your after, are treated as grid items. They will flow with the grid. They'll take up the space of a grid cell. I think that's super awesome. You can use grid template areas to name areas of your grid. So let's take a look at this example. So we can use this grid template areas option to create named sections of our grid. So in this case, if you have a look, I have essentially made the grid layout, but in text. So what I've said here is I want a 4-column grid with 4 rows. And I want the top row to be all header. I want the second row to have a sidebar and then 3 columns of intro. The third row sidebar, 3 columns of outro, and the fourth row is going to be all footer, which I think is a really nice and visual way of writing out your grid. It certainly, for me, is more readable than, span 3 or start 1, end 4. And then what we do is we just style up each of those individually, and our markup looks really nice too. And if we go back, if you're feeling particularly devil may care, you can name your grid areas with emoji, which is what I've done here. So I think I have unicorns and cats and hearts and fire and rainbows in there, and that is supported and works fine. We've ended up with the same layout. What I've done here as well is set the height for each one. So that's 6 rem of height there, 300 pixels. This one's set to auto, which is why it's collapsed down to the height of that little heart. And then the bottom one is set in pixels as well. Yep. And then each of these are the width of the columns. So I've set that sidebar column to be slightly narrower and the rest of them to have 30% of the width, which means that you can have real control over the size that you want your grid to be, and you can use whatever units you want for sizing. They all work. You can use display contents to kind of get a similar experience to what you might want from a subgrid. So when I say that, let's take a look at an example and see why this might be important. So your designer has now come to you with some beautiful cat facts, and they want you to add this module into your website. And with your grid sort of mind on, you might see that this might be laid out as a grid. If I was going to build it as a grid, I'd do it like this. So we've got 2 columns, and then we've got 6 rows, but those first 3 elements are going to span 2 rows each. But if I wanted to mark this up, because I'm a conscientious developer, please be a link. I want to mark those up as list items, because for my users who, for whatever reason, don't have CSS or are viewing this maybe through a screen reader, we want the markup to make sense. This is a list of cat facts. I want these to be a list. My markup is good. But because I now have a UL which must contain LIs, marking up our grid has suddenly got more difficult, because I've got this LI element in the way of the bits that I want to actually set as the grid cells. So the things that I want to be cells are these three spans. And the li is going to be the thing that actually inherits grid when I set display grid on the UL. So I can use this display contents option, and what it does is it makes the li act as if it had no bounding rectangle. So as if it was a text element. And it means that then the elements inside that UL, that li, are able to act as if they were your grid cells. This is kind of, this is replicating what we would want from subgrid if we had support for subgrid, which we will in the future. It's not there yet. Display contents is also not very well supported, unfortunately. But it's an option for you that you can use at the moment. And then the final cool thing that I have to show you is this defining your track sizing with max content and min content, which I think is super cool. So we've got a grid of elements here, and I've got a piece of text in here which says 1 is a long article. And I've set the grid template columns to min content 1FR, 1FR. So what min content is doing is it's going to shrink that cell to be the smallest size that it can possibly be. So at the moment, the smallest size it could possibly be is the length of that very long word. If I set it to max content, it's going to stretch to be the widest content that it contains, which is all of that text in one line. And it means that you can change the size of your grid cells using just this really nice piece of styling. Just so you know, max content and min content don't have to be used with grid. You can use them as a width on anything. So maybe if you've got an H1 that you want to have a background color but only be a certain size, then you can use it there. That's kind of awesome. If you want to learn more about CSS Grid, this is a really lovely site. You can learn CSS Grid by watering carrots in your garden. I highly recommend it. If watering carrots isn't your thing and you'd rather actually have a tutorial, then CSSGrid.io is really great. It's by Wesboss. It's like an incredibly in-depth tutorial on CSS Grid. That's me, and that's Grid.